Hi, my name is Rachel Saunders. Welcome to the Temporal Hospitality podcast. In this episode, we're going to be exploring how gender-critical adherents are essentially acting as Benedict Arnolds against women's rights. I want to preface this by stating that today, the US state of Montana's House of Representatives passed a bill making being trans in certain spaces indecent, essentially criminalising trans people simply for existing as themselves. While this bill might get struck down, it is emblematic of the process of stripping trans rights from trans people and essentially shifting fundamental citizenship within society. It is not enough to draw parallels with Nazi Germany or highlight how this is getting dangerously close to post-revolutionary Iran in its attempts to control normative understandings of bodies. What is happening in real time to trans people in America and around the world is the road to perdition, to a statelessness where even the will and the desire to escape becomes impossible because governments refuse to acknowledge trans personhood and therefore the ability to get documentation that matches trans people's identities. It is paving the way for men like Eichmann to return, to abuse their position and turn being trans into the means through which to cow all women who do not fit the gender-critical conception of womanhood. This is also deeply problematic because last week you also saw cisgender women in America being targeted in bathrooms by cisgender men for not conforming to their perception of what those women ought to have been. If you walk down through Boston, you are prompted to follow the Freedom Trail outlining how the early days of the American Revolution developed. Atop Bunker Hill is a monument to the battle that signified the revolutionaries could hold their own against the British, though ultimately it was the support of the French Navy a few years later, at the Battle of the Chesapeake Bay, which decided the war. The lesson from this is that all revolutionaries require allies, require funding, and require demonising those on the other side in order to gain popular support. During the Revolutionary War, the British were cast as the evil empire, when, in reality, the root causes of the American Revolution were more complex, and in part were down to the British failing to understand the American mindset after the French Indian Wars and the increase in taxation that the British put onto the American population to fund the defence of the American colonies. This is much the case with gender-critical railroading of trans rights. Since 1860, trans discourse has developed a deep and rich history of fighting against oppressive laws and social customs, all the while embedding those laws and customs into its own folklore. To be trans has always been shaped by the society in which a trans person is born, with no two cultures or societies conceiving transness in the same way. The trans revolution was a slow-burning one, often beset with issues and problems, especially when societies that deemed trans bodies non-normative decided to oppress them and essentially turn society against trans people. Those fears flowed into cis allies who either distanced themselves or, especially with the gay rights movement, decided in the 1950s that it would be easier to separate out trans identities from queer identities for the sake of political advancement. In turn, trans people were framed as mentally ill in order to be able to access healthcare and access the support that they needed in order to live affirmed lives. It was only with the help of allies and people willing to contribute financial support of the trans revolution that eventually trans rights, as they are currently conceived, were achieved, which in turn has led to a counter-revolution to push back against the trans revolution. The issue for gender critics is essentially they are looking through a mirror darkly. The gender critical movements has used pretty much the same tactics as the trans revolution. However, this time, gender critics have had much deeper pockets and much more prominent allies. To be gender critical has shifted from being a fringe obsession with a handful of second and third wave feminists into being a causa célèbre for the far right, because they wish to control women's bodies in a way that they see as normative. To be gender critical is essentially to have allied yourself with a white nationalist movement that deems women as breeders of the next generation and as weapons in a culture war that targets anybody who is deemed non-normative. The gender critical revolution is therefore more akin to a reactionary purge of trans revolutionaries than it is actually a true revolution. Essentially, it is like the French monarchy returning to Paris in 1812. The irony is that gender critical discourse has suffused most of history, and you only need to look at the translated versions of the Bible to see the enforcement of dimorphic sex as the root of all Judeo-Christian society. Reactionary politics expects simplistic understanding because complicated nuance undermines the reasoning behind such gender critical values, namely the desire to control and impose a set of values on society. Hannah Arendt, during her coverage of the Eichmann trial, castigated Eichmann for his banality of action, namely that he acted without thinking, without engaging with the reasons why he did what he did. In the 2001 film Conspiracy, there is a masterful take on the Wannsee Conference, in which the final solution was euphemistically outlined, and all of the Nazi high command came together to rubber stamp the slaughter of the Jews. Eichmann is depicted as a lackey serving his masters, dutifully organising and signing off on the consignment of every Jew to their slaughter. Gender critics who complain that stating there is a trans genocide in the works fail to spot the parallels because they too fail to connect their actions to the end results. They do not think about what they are espousing, only seeing trans people as an amorphous threat to some preconceived effemina of womanhood that they consider under threat. Trans people are being put on the road to perdition because enough gender critical people have convinced themselves that they are counter-revolutionaries, that they are acting in a way which is beneficial for women and beneficial for society. What they don't see is that their belief that they are essentially Benjamin Franklin's is in reality the actions of a Benedict Arnold or a Lord Haw-Haw, turncoats who are doing true damage to the feminist cause because it is enabling men to roll back many of the hard-won rights that women obtained across the last 2 centuries. One does not side with the oppressor unless there is power and scraps to be gleaned. And the gender critics who crow about successfully rolling back trans rights fail to see that the next stop is women's voting rights and all women being gender checked in every sport they play every time they wish to play. Trans women are only a threat because gender critics cannot face the fact that womanhood is conceived beyond their own reactionary framing, and is easier to be an Arnold than it is to be a Marquis de Lafayette, siding with those fighting for liberty. Montana's bill echo misconceived social worries about trans bodies, and it will only be enforced on those trans people who cannot or will not pass for the sake of social conformity. It condemns the poor, the dispossessed and the iconoclastic to perdition, all for the sake of making the Benedict Arnolds of the world feel a fraction safer in their beds. All the while, the actual wolves who prey on women and children are left to run churches, to be elected to office, and attack national allies on live television. The road to perdition is paved with those who endorse reactionary politics, only to realise too late that the wolves really are coming for them. And this isn't something which is a modern trend. You see this throughout the history of women's rights, that every time women have fought for a pluralistic understanding of womanhood, you have seen a core element of women, usually rich, usually middle class, stating that the revolutionaries are the ones who don't understand what a woman is. You saw this with the suffragette movement, you see this in the movements in India when they push back against the hegemonic conception of caste. You see this in Afghanistan with women who have been trying to push back for women's rights being silenced by the majority. And this is where gender criticism leads. It is an imposition of what ought to be, rather than accepting that every woman has the right to her own experiences and her own way of conceiving the world. It is not revolutionary to be gender critical. It is deeply reactionary and deeply conservative. It bears remembering that gender critical philosophies flowed out of Catholic dogma, and that much of what we conceive of as sex-based politics actually comes from the 1930s. As Michael Walters outlines in The Other Olympians, worries about women's sport were never focused on trans women. They were focused on women who were not deemed woman enough. Indeed, all you have to do is read the history of the early Olympics, and the recent calls for sex-based testing was weaponized during that period against any woman not deemed woman enough. What gender critics fail in their reactionary urge to reimpose sex-based testing, that throughout the entire history of the Olympic movement, it is not trans women who've been caught out. It is cisgender women who have been caught out through either having an intersex condition, or too high testosterone, or some other biological and chemical process within their bodies that falls outside an understanding of what is normative. You saw this last summer in the Paris Olympics, where two boxers were targeted by gender critics and deemed not women enough, simply because A, they refused to take a gender test, but also B, they refused to acknowledge the gender critical discourse floating around them. And when they did come out and defend themselves, gender critics had a field day of it, and there was a whole ream of gender critical discourse based around the fact that these women were not deemed normative enough. And this is the true problem with gender critical discourse, is that you can point to an entire history showing why gender critical discourse fails and how harmful it is to women's rights. In fact, I've got a whole bookcase full of books outlining these problems, but it's never enough, because what gender critics want to see, and what they have been desiring to see, is a simplistic notion of womanhood based on dimorphic sex, to say we are going to set a manifest destiny at birth, of which that is the only way a woman can be conceived as a woman. Anything else falls outside what a woman ought to be. Yet, by framing it so narrowly, what they are essentially doing is saying to the men who are backing their movement, okay, we accept that a woman can only be framed thus. If you legislate for this, we accept that any woman, no matter what their background or what their position in life is going to have their identity eradicated and erased. For me, that's unacceptable. Trans-inclusive feminism is not just simply about going trans women matter or trans women should be included. It's about going that womanhood as a pluralistic concept within a liberal democratic society shouldn't be defined by a narrow conception of dimorphic sex. It is rooted in self-understanding, and the moment you say you are a woman, you are a woman. Because anything else essentially imprisons women in a cage built by other people. You saw this in Nazi Germany, you see this in Iran, you see this in Afghanistan, you see this in any community that rejects feminism. It is not feminist to say that woman ought to be, or should be, or must be, because a woman simply is somebody who understands herself as a woman. Anything else is both reductive and harmful to the feminist cause. Hence why it is right to call gender critical women Benedict Arnolds and anti-feminists. They are essentially acting against their own best interests and selling out feminism for their own self-serving ends.